It's already been over a year since we made the top 10 3D dungeons lists, and we're sorry that you had to wait for so long before seeing the top 10 2D dungeons list, but nevertheless, here it is.
We said in that video that had we made a top 10 list for all dungeons, that top 10 would still only consist of 3D dungeons. Because, well, we really love 3D dungeons more than 2D.
This might be just our thing, but we've said before that we sometimes have a hard time distinguishing 2D dungeons from one another. We just feel that there's so much more that can be done to make a dungeon unique in a 3D environment rather than 2D, which is also why we had so few dungeon rankings among the 2D games.
Still, we promised you a list of our 10 favorite 2D dungeons and we have made one. It was really hard, but there are certain 2D games that handle dungeons really well. We might have a list here that is totally different from yours, but remember, this is our opinion and our experiences with these dungeons that are taken into consideration.
Like the 3D dungeons, we've picked the ones we enjoy the difficulty of, the puzzles, the enemies, the concept, and something we feel that a lot of the 2D dungeons usually have lacked, but have gotten much better later in the series: atmosphere.
Also, if you're familiar with our previous dungeon rankings, please remember that our opinions might change over time, and the ones we pick here might not be a true reflection to the choices we made back then.
So, without any further ado, we're the owners of Triforce. I'm owner 1.
And I'm owner 2, and let us present to you our top 10 2D dungeons in the Zelda series.
Four Swords Adventures was sort of a strange game when it comes to dungeons. There are some very clear dungeons here with the temples and palaces everywhere, but there were no dungeon maps in these places or anything, and they weren't necessarily longer than a regular level, which were also pretty restrictive in their own rights.
So even though these dungeons might not be totally different from regular levels, we do feel like they are worth a mention somewhere, and the one we've chosen for this list is actually one that occurred very early in the game.
The second world, so to speak, had a very good end level for being so early in the game, with the Eastern Temple. We thought this place had pretty good atmosphere with it being dark and foggy, and even having vines growing along the walls.
The difficulty isn't that high since it's so early, and it doesn't have a concept that really stands out, but it has pretty cool enemies, and the one thing we really love about this place is the complexity.
One thing about the complexity is the use of moon pearls and this game's version of a dark world, but also, this is a multiplayer game, and when you play, you are usually tied to the big TV screen where everyone's visible. However, thanks to the Game Boy Advance connectors, there are certain sections you're able to walk off the TV screen and roam by yourself, in which you can follow yourself on the GBA screen instead.
And this dungeon is pretty complex because of that. There's this web of rooms that was complex enough with just 2 players, but we can imagine how fun it would be with 2 more and how we could easily lose each other while exploring this place.
In addition, there's a good number of traps and some good puzzles, and a variety of some of our favorite enemies in the series that keep this dungeon interesting all the way, but what really made this enjoyable to us was the multiplayer aspect along with its complexity.
Link's Awakening is one of the examples of dungeon lineups we had a hard time ranking because the dungeons here really aren't that easy to distinguish from one another. They all looked very similar and there weren't really any themes or elements put into these dungeons that would make them different. To us, none of the dungeons stood out until we came to the last 2, and for this spot, we chose the 7th dungeon, Eagle's Tower.
We're under the impression that most people think that Eagle's Tower is sort of a frustrating dungeon with a complex structure that was sort of hard to navigate. We used to think that too, but after playing this again recently, it wasn't as tedious as our impression and earlier experience had us to believe.
No matter if it's a little bit tedious or not, we got to admit that this dungeon deserves a spot because of its really awesome concept. Eagle's Tower is, well, a tower. But there's this one weird thing about the giant hole in the middle of one of the floors, and there's no way to reach the rooms right above.
That's where the concept comes in. In order to proceed further up, There are these 4 pillars you have to destroy with a big ball, and when you do, the upper floor will fall down into place, and you're now able to reach the top of the tower.
This is very interesting to us, and definitely something that makes the dungeon a bit different from the rest in the same game, even in the entire series. It's also worth mentioning that the dungeon becomes even less tedious if you have the boomerang when you arrive here, because that makes it able for you to get the mirror shield early and proceed a lot easier. A good dungeon, worthy of this top 10. Even though we both love A Link to the Past, we have to admit that not all dungeons in this game really differ from one another. But it's because we love the game so much that it's somewhat easy to pick out our favorites from this game. For the number 8 spot, we picked the first dungeon in the Dark World, the Palace of Darkness.
This is one of my favorites in the game, and a few reasons for that is the sort of this slight dark atmosphere it pulls off. It might be grey and colorless, but there's still a bit of darkness in this place that makes it a bit fun to explore. But the best thing? The complexity.
It's not the most complex dungeon ever, but it has a very good amount of it. Since this dungeon is placed in the exact same spot as the Eastern Palace in the Light World, they chose to have some similarities between the two. Right off the bat, you start off with 3 different doors, which is similar in both of them. However, the Palace of Darkness actually has 2 additional paths to choose, even with warp points in some of these rooms that will eventually bring you to a place where the different directions will meet again.
This is what we like about the dungeon. No matter how many times I've played this game, I never know or remember a right way to go. This dungeon is pretty open for exploration, and there are plenty of paths to choose from, and it's up to you if you want to go and get the big key right away, or find the map and fairies in another direction. This is a small thing, but we also love how you get to walk around the pathway that leads to the boss in the darkness. It's a little peek of the place you'll eventually end up at.
We understand if a lot of people would disagree with this choice, as this dungeon is a bit biased with how we could just say that we just like it for what it is. But really, the darkness and the complexity makes this a very enjoyable dungeon, and especially a great introduction to the 7 dungeon lineup in the Dark World.
The DS games had some pretty short and quick, but also some very clever dungeons. For this list, we've picked only one from Phantom Hourglass, and it's the GORON Temple.
The big reason for this is how parts of the dungeon is split into 2, with one character doing each their own part of it. Before you enter the temple, you get recognized by the GORON leader as a brother of the tribe, after going through a series of fun questions and paying all the reward money back again.
However, there's this one little whiny kid called GORON who says he won't recognize Link as a real brother of the GORON tribe. He's supposed to show Link the dungeon, but he runs off to see if Link's even capable to keep up with him. There's no sign of him until you reach the dungeon, and after going through a couple of rooms, you learn that he was captured by some monsters and that he apologizes for his behavior while asking for help.
This is where the 2 controllable characters concept comes in. On the left side of the floor, you control Link. On the right side, you control GORON, and you switch between the 2 to solve puzzles and open paths for one another.
Playing as GORON is fun. They definitely put the characteristics of a GORON in his character, because he can roll and destroy rocks that are in his way. You don't get to control him a whole lot, and even though we never count the bosses into this, you do have him in control in that battle as well.
But the rest of the dungeon has some good enemies to fight, and we really like how the bomb chews are being used in this game, with the stylus and all. The dungeon keeps up with good puzzles and is in general a pretty enjoyable one.
Our personal bias slightly helped the Palace of Darkness to find its way to this list, even though we can objectively find it really good too. But when we take that second point into consideration with the other dungeons in the same game, we realize how cool the whole concept of Skullwoods really is.
What we like about Skullwoods is the big number of entrances this place has, and how the dungeon is split up to many parts. You have a clear entrance to the place, but there are also holes in the ground that can let you into rooms that might seem unreachable from where we first came in.
The fact that you have to go through other exits further into the woods and then find a new part of the dungeon just makes this more interesting to us. This whole place, both the dungeon itself and the forest it's in, just feels so dark and creepy. And when the dungeon is filled with Stalfos, Gibdos and Wallmasters, it doesn't really make it feel less creepy.
The last section also has one of the strangest and most disgusting entrances we've seen, as you use the fire rod to burn up this insect thing and reveal a new opening in the mouth of this skull thing. It's also pretty creepy how there are two eyes that open up when you do so.
The dungeon is pretty damn complex, which is great, and it has a lot of paths to take if you want to explore the whole dungeon. However, if you know what you're doing, you can skip a lot of it too, so it's kinda up to you in how long this dungeon is. Obviously though, you might not be able to willingly skip a lot unless you've played through this dungeon before.
Another thing that's really interesting is that the first thing you see when you go into what we see as the original entrance is the big chest. From that point, you know where the item is and you need the big key. When you get it, you can go back here and almost go straight for the boss.
Add good puzzles with the star tiles and you have yourself a very unique and cool 2D dungeon.
Minish Cap has a really solid lineup of dungeons, especially for a 2D game. These dungeons were very well themed and actually has a really good atmosphere. One that definitely falls into this category is the Palace of Winds.
This dungeon is placed high up in the sky, even above the clouds, which is evident in the way that you actually go through a world of clouds before you reach this dungeon. All you can see beneath you is, well, the color blue and white clouds. That's how high up you are, that you can't even see the land below you.
This dungeon is very atmospheric with that background and the great music. With this being a dungeon in the air and having the word winds in its name, then of course air and wind is gonna play a certain role, and that is with the item you get inside this place, the Rock's Cape. This allows you to glide through the air and use wind to glide even further, and it's used in great ways to get around this place.
The dungeon is structured in the way that the first half is very linear and in the open air, while the second half is more complex like a regular dungeon, with indoor rooms and some darkness to it. The dungeon also has a great number of cool enemies that we both enjoy seeing and fighting.
The puzzles are also quite clever, and it's a dungeon that's pretty enjoyable all the way through, at least after the linear part, which is sort of boring, but the more puzzle and labyrinth oriented second half makes the dungeon much better.
What even felt a bit awesome is how you just have to jump down from the fortress to fight the Darknut before entering the second half. This place is filled with pretty good stuff, and definitely deserves its place on this list.
The second DS game probably has better dungeons than Phantom Hourglass, as Spirit Tracks brought in some that really differ from one another, with a type of natural element being the theme of each of them. The one we ended up liking the most was the Sand Temple.
Desert dungeons are really intriguing, and this one is no exception. The outside of it is almost like a huge pyramid, which is already awesome, but even before you get to enter, you need to go through 3 trials, which involves the train. However, the last trial is the closest you come to being involved with the dungeon, as you have to destroy the cannons around the structure, and the inside is filled with, well, sand.
This dungeon introduced a brand new item in the sand wand that can raise the level of sand. This is used in many ways, like making bridges that allows you to reach new places, but also for puzzle solving, defeating enemies, and even finding items like a key.
A lot of the dungeon is really about the sand and how you can use it to your advantage. It's used to roll over huge objects like these rollers here, and these cubes that you need to roll into the right position. Honestly, we really enjoy these puzzles.
But the puzzles also offer use of other items than just the sand rod, which makes the variety a bit better, but it's heavily relied on the rod itself when you go through this dungeon.
Even though the Sand Temple shares the same theme as the Fire Temple, we feel it fits better here. It's actually a pretty good fit for both, but we feel it's a bit better for a desert setting.
What can we say? We really love desert dungeons. As mentioned, they're so intriguing. The Desert Palace in A Link Between Worlds is pretty similar to the Sand Temple in Spirit Tracks, with there being sand on the ground everywhere and the sand rod being incredibly similar to the sand wand, only it raises sand in a straight line rather than everywhere we press the stylus.
The dungeons really are pretty similar. You use the sand rod to raise the sand in a lot of the same ways when it comes to puzzle solving, like with these boulders here, and how you use it to defeat a few certain enemies, find treasures buried in the sand, and so on. But there's another really cool thing here with how you need to fill up rooms with sand, kind of like a water dungeon would do.
So this dungeon is a bit similar to the Sand Temple in many ways, but some things we like better in the Desert Palace is how you can raise the sand level for a few rooms, but most of all is the atmosphere. My god, the music here is fantastic, and seeing the sand pour in helps as well. The sand itself also has this golden look, and helps make this place so much more ancient and important. It might not really be that important, like a real temple to any kind of people, but it gives us that feeling and we enjoy it.
Not that it's very important since it's about the boss, but it's very interesting how this dungeon doesn't actually contain its boss, because you enter the palace in Hyrule, while the boss actually exists in Lorule, which is an interesting thing. The Desert Palace is a very enjoyable dungeon to us, and we have no problem placing it on number 3 on our lists.
I'm really not a fan of ice dungeons, but that should tell you what a really good job they did with the ice ruins in A Link Between Worlds. The ice physics is of course what I find most annoying about them, but it really wasn't too slippery or troubling here.
One thing from the beginning we find really cool is the elevator. This elevator can take you down to any floor you want, and the big key can even be found right away, since it's at the bottom there. With the accessibility to at least a small part of every floor, there's not a very clear path of where you're supposed to head first, meaning that it's open for a tiny bit of exploration from the start.
This dungeon contains a lot of puzzles based around ice and how we can melt it, of course. But not everything is about melting the ice you stumble upon, because there are some pathways that can melt away really easily. With this, there's also quite a bit of platforming, but that's something we don't mind, even though walking on small slippery paths can be a bit challenging.
There's quite a bit of complexity to this dungeon, and one big reason for that is this huge platform that gets moved around by pulling a few switches and allows you to proceed. Another thing is that you can reach a lot of the rooms pretty early, but to do everything there is to do in those rooms as soon as you enter is rare, meaning that you have to access it from other places or just do something more elsewhere before you return.
This dungeon is also very atmospheric. We're in ruins of ice structures, but they're placed in the mountains, high above lava that you can see underneath. The music sounds a bit chilly, which is good, but there's also that little feeling of dread whenever you walk on the narrow platforms and look down and see what's below you. This dungeon is very solid, especially for an ice dungeon, and we think it deserves its place as the runner-up.
We know we have a desert dungeon on 4th and 3rd place, and 2 ice dungeons on top of that. It might be a bit repetitive, but that's how we realized we would rank these dungeons. And even though we both usually enjoy desert dungeons a lot more than ice, we can't deny how great both the ice ruins and especially here, the number 1 dungeon, the Temple of Droplets from Minish Cap really is. Why?
Because even though the main element of this dungeon is ice, it's not all about ice. This dungeon also has water in it, and some puzzles and elements revolve around light and darkness, seeing as the item you get inside here is the lantern.
The beginning of this dungeon is actually very interesting. First of all, this is one of the 2 dungeons in the game that you enter as the size of a Picori. One other very interesting thing is that the first door you see isn't only locked. The lock is actually the one you need the big key for. That sounds a bit too quick that you're supposed to find the boss there already, but after solving a puzzle to find the big key, you'll know why.
What you find there actually is the water element and a huge octorok frozen down. You have found what you came looking for, but there's no way for you to retrieve it before you have melted the ice around it. Already here, this dungeon is doing something very interesting. From what you did when you retrieved the big key, you know that a lot of the ice inside this place needs to be melted by the sunbeams that can shine through when you open up these doors.
Later though, you get the lantern that not only is used to light torches and areas around you, but it's also apparently super effective when it comes to melting ice blocks. The dungeon is good with its puzzles and use of items, as you need to use a few old ones to get around. The ice physics really don't feel too bad here either, and we really enjoy these ice block puzzles.
Its atmosphere is also great. You find yourself in these really dark and cold depths in the ground, and the music fits so well for it. It makes the dungeon feel a bit darker, a bit colder, and that only makes it more exciting, and even enough to make it as our number 1 2D dungeon in the series. Top 10 2D dungeons. That was not an easy task, so please let us know what you think of our list, and of course like this video if you thought it was good. Don't forget to leave your own favorites in the comments as well.
As for our next countdown, we're skipping a music list this time, and go ahead with a bit more of a unique topic, and for the first time be a little negative in a top 10 list. So hit that subscribe button if you don't want to miss out on our top 10 worst repeats in the Zelda series. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you then.